Well, we are ready to get started. I want to say welcome to another iteration of our International Business Roundtable series. Thank you. We're ready to begin. I want to say thank you to our hosts, Dorsey and Whitney and KPMG, again, for partnering with my organization, Global Minnesota, in putting this event series together. We're so proud to be partnering with two of our corporate members as well as all of you today. My name's Steve Riedel. I'm Corporate Relations Officer for Global Minnesota. In a moment, I'm going to invite Phil, our president, up to give you a welcome and to introduce our speaker. But before I do, I want to say welcome to two special guests we have here from Ontario. In Toronto, Ben Garrow and Earl Provost are here visiting us actually from Chicago. They're here with the Ontario Trade and Investment Office, and they are here to meet our businesses. So please introduce yourselves to them. Welcome, Ben and Earl. Now I'd like to invite our president, Phil Hansen, up to say a few words of welcome. Phil?
Well, good morning, everyone. Wow, this is going to be a great program today. I have to say, I had a chance to be with the whole crew last night for dinner. It's going to be a very fascinating group of speakers, presenters today. I think a great conversation on an important topic that we're all going to get to hear about on artificial intelligence in the legal, accounting, and health services areas. So we're just excited. We have, I think, about 40 or 50 folks in the room with us today, over 100 on the phone. So we're close to 200 participants in the program today, both in person and virtually with us. And so we're excited to have you all here today. I'm Phil Hansen. I'm the president of Global Minnesota. I want to welcome you on behalf of our organization and welcome, of course, our corporate members that are in the room with us today. Thank you for joining us for this great program. For those of you that not familiar with Global Minnesota, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, membership-based organization. We are very much focused on international engagement and creating greater international understanding. For our business community, we develop and deliver programs on sustainability topics, international trade, global trends, and foreign policy. In addition, we host probably 40 to 50 professional exchange delegations from all over the world. Over the past year, over 130 countries participated with us in our delegation visits. We also deliver a wide range of world affairs programming with visiting diplomats, ambassadors, and foreign policy experts. We're able to do all of this because of the support of our great members and the participants that are part of our programs. Global Minnesota corporate members, Dorsey and Whitney and KPMG, are real standout corporate members of Global Minnesota. They supported the International Business Roundtable series for many years now. I particularly want to thank Jessica Libby from KPMG, Dave Townsend from Dorsey for their leadership, along with Allison Humphrey and the whole Dorsey team who have really worked hard to put together today's program. Please join me in thanking Dorsey Whitney and KPMG. Just a couple of upcoming programs that you might find interesting as part of what we do at Global Minnesota. Global Minnesota will be presenting several excellent upcoming events. On February 26th, we have our Culture Through Cuisine event, which is an Ethiopian meal event that we'll be having. On February 29th, we have Insights on Kosovo from the Kosovar ambassador to the United States. On March 4th in Edina, we're going to be having a great decisions discussion on Middle East realignment. On March 5th, we have a Get to Know Global Minnesota event. And on March 21st, we have a Sustainable Development Goals Roundtable, Resiliency in a Water-Changed World. And finally, on March 27th, we're having a great global social event with our Young Leaders of the Americas and Entrepreneurs Initiative. Please think about joining us for one of these terrific events that we have coming up. Our roundtable program today will take up the important issue of the use and impact of artificial intelligence in the legal, accounting, and health services settings. The program will feature a keynote address followed by a panel of business and legal experts from Dorsey Whitney, KPMG, Mayo Clinic, and the University of Minnesota, discussing how rapid developments in artificial intelligence are creating opportunities and risks for all businesses. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today. Probably not surprisingly, I went out onto ChatGPT to create this introduction. I thought that would be appropriate for today. So I mostly used that. I embellished a little bit because I thought it wasn't quite, didn't quite really fully capture just the incredible accomplishments of this presenter. So I'm going to give you the introduction mostly from ChatGPT. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Daniel Schwartz, an eminent and award-winning scholar whose cutting-edge research sits at the dynamic intersection of artificial intelligence, law, and consulting services. A distinguished professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, Professor Schwartz has dedicated a significant portion of his illustrious career to exploring the transformative effect of technology on the legal landscape. His groundbreaking studies offer a deep insight into how AI can both challenge and enhance traditional legal frameworks, especially in the realms of insurance law, regulatory policies, and consumer protection. How's that feeling so far, Professor? Is AI getting you pretty well? All right. Beyond the walls of academia, Professor Schwartz is a visionary who actively shapes the future of AI in legal practices. His prolific contributions include advising legislative bodies, engaging with legislative leaders, and fostering dialogue at the international level to address ethical, privacy, and regulatory issues brought forth by AI. Professor Schwartz regularly testifies before U.S. congressional committees on insurance matters, and he has served as an expert witness in a wide range of insurance disputes. From 2007 to 14, he served as the commissioner, consumer representative at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. His expertise has made him a sought-after speaker and a trusted consultant, where his engaging delivery and profound understanding of the material weave together to provide compelling narratives about our collective future in an AI-driven world. That sounds pretty awesome, actually. So we are so thrilled to have Professor Schwartz with us. What a great speaker and presenter to have. And so I'm going to turn the podium over to you. Welcome, Professor.
All right. Well, it's really it is a pleasure to be here. And as the introduction was a bit much, but I am actually quite interested in how artificial intelligence and generative AI in particular is affecting the legal landscape. And so what my basic plan is today, I'm going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes before we transition to a panel. And what I'm going to do first is just do a little bit of level setting. I'm not going to be able to explain to you how Gen AI works, but I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what it is and how it differs from other types of AI. Then after that, what I'm going to do is delve into some empirical literature that I've been involved in. So the first set of empirical, results I'm going to talk about are how Gen AI can perform on legal exams, right? Things like the bar exam, law school exams. And to the extent that you think that those are actually representative of what real lawyers do, that's a contested question that different lawyers and law students will give you answers to. That, of course, provides some indication about what the power of these technologies are. But after that, I'm actually going to look at some more recent research that I've been looking into, that I've been a part of, where we actually try to test how Gen AI can perform at more realistic legal tasks relative to real attorneys. And then after that, we're going to say, okay, well, what have we learned and where are we going? So that's the basic framework for the talk. So let's get down to it. So the first thing I want to make sure we understand is some terminology. Okay, artificial intelligence is this very broad label that different people define differently. And we can really sort of just think about it at a very high level as machines doing things that seem smart, seem to represent intelligence as we understand it at a human level. But folks are always differing, changing about what AI means. If you ask someone 40 years ago, what is artificial intelligence, they'd probably give you a pretty different answer than what we would have today. There are two real branches of artificial intelligence that you can think of. So the first is machine learning, and the second is symbolic AI. Symbolic AI uses sort of pre-formulated rules that are reflected in algorithms that are designed by people to make machines act intelligently. So if you design a video game and you have a character and you say, well, if the character gets too close to another character, they should jump backwards, and here's how we're going to do that, you'll encode those rules into the AI. And symbolic AI works great for certain types of purposes, in particular what are called expert systems, right, where we have really clear rules about how you should operate in different places. An AI system can work well. Think about TurboTax, that's symbolic AI. Now, machine learning AI is where we're focused these days. And a lot of people will just use AI and machine learning AI these days interchangeably. And machine learning AI is when, rather than having some human encode rules into computer code about how the computer is supposed to act, instead, the basic model is to have the computer learn for itself the rules to be followed based on massive amounts of data. Okay, and so machine learning AI requires training data where a machine is going to learn over time based on that data how to behave. Now, machine learning AI itself can be split into two basic components. So the first and the more familiar to folks, at least until last year, was what's broadly described as discriminative AI, but I think a more helpful label, though not quite accurate, is predictive AI, right? Is this a dog or a cat? That was a very famous first example. Or is there a tumor in this scan? Yes, no. Now, it can be machine learning AI because the way that these algorithms are trained is you give them lots of examples of here are scans with tumors, here are scans without tumors that are labeled typically by experts, and you have the AI over time learn on its own how to discriminate between the two. And so that discriminative AI is an important field. It's very important still. It's very important in medicine and very important in law. But of course, where the real action has been in the last year or two as a result of sort of the explosion of ChatGPT is in generative AI. And generative AI is also a machine learning technique, but it's a machine learning technique in which the output is not some prediction, not some yes, no, but instead is some sort of output that we normally associate with human beings, okay? Text, voice, images. And so that can be split into two as well. Actually, can be split into more areas. But what we're going to focus on is what are called large language models, of which ChatGPT is an example, where what the generative AI is doing is generating text in response to prompts. And the reason why I'm going to focus on that is because it's the most relevant for law, at least the practice of law. Because if you know anything about lawyers, what do they like to do? Talk and write. That's our trade, right? And so if you have something that's really good at producing text, gee, that at least seems a little threatening to lawyers. By the way, cat pictures, not so much, right? But on the other hand, text that looks really good, that can do what we do, that really is potentially transformative for the practice of law. So that's where we're going to be focusing on, a particular type of machine learning AI, generative AI, that produces text. Now, how does this work? We're going to talk about it at a very high level of generality, but it's helpful, I think, to focus on the GPT term. That is just one type of LLM. There are other types of LLMs that are out there. Claude is one. They're often just referred to as chatbots, okay? And the reason why it's helpful is because each of these terms tells us something about basic elements of this technology. So the way this technology works is that you feed into the input layer, okay, some text, right? You basically say, hey, here's my prompt. Tell me about whatever. Tell me about, the definition of this legal term. That would be your input. That gets translated into computational data in ways that are actually very familiar. We can turn text into data, and it gets fed into this neural network. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. And then there's an output, and the output is the response, right? So at a very high level of generality, you can think about the input as your prompt, and you can think about the output as the response that it gives you. Now, that is where the generative piece comes in. It is generating text in response to your prompt. Technically, it's actually generating sort of individual tokens, or you can think of them as individual words, one at a time. And essentially what it's doing is it's just predicting, based upon all the training data that it had, what the next word in the sequence is going to be, given all the prior text, given your prompt, and given everything it said to date. How does it do that? It seems like magic. And honestly, it seems like magic even to those who are very sophisticated, and this much more sophisticated in the underlying technology than I am. We know that it is pre-trained, right? And that pre-training occurs where before you get the final version of this, you set all of these internal weights, and these are just sort of connections, okay, to some sort of baseline, and you start feeding the AI text, all the text on the internet. At least that's what we're told. It's a little bit unclear what these different LLMs are trained on, in particular ChatGPT. We don't know for sure what it's been trained on, but for all intents and purposes, we can think of the entire internet, right? So OpenAI scraped the entire internet or something close to it, and it started feeding that into these machines, into the input layer, and asking it essentially predict the next word in this newspaper article. And at first, and it had an algorithm where, some prediction would be made, and either that would be good or bad. And then the algorithm would say, no, that's not good. And then the weights in these internal layers would be changed until eventually this thing was pre-trained and ready to go. Once it's pre-trained and ready to go, once the model is pre-trained, it's not going to change. Okay, it's pre-trained. So you're not going to change the model by asking it queries. You open up a new chat, it's going to be the same model. Now, how does this work? Well, the real magic of it is this transformer architecture. And the transformer architecture is a particular type of what are called neural networks that, roughly speaking, seeks to emulate brain structure. Okay, and so there are all these connections over here that are weighted by what are called parameters that basically make connections in the same way, or at least are in a way motivated by the human brain. And so we actually have no idea how, this is why these are called hidden layers, how it is that it goes from input to output in a way that seems almost magical. All we know is by continually having it change the connections in these billions of hidden layers, eventually we get to a result where we get something like ChatGPT. That's much simplified. There's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more in terms of additional fine-tuning, human feedback into the system. But really, that's all you need to know in order to get to the next set of questions, which is, okay, how is this going to affect the law? So let me try to get to that. So the first thing that you might ask is, well, how can this perform on legal exams? And as soon as ChatGPT came out, I was lucky enough to be involved in a paper that got a lot of press, where essentially what we did is we fed law school exams into ChatGPT, and then we blindly graded the results. And we found, remarkably, that if we just put our exams into ChatGPT, the answers we got were actually equivalent to not so high-performing students, but they were passing our law school exams. And that was ChatGPT 3.5. So first, we're like, gee, this might be able to do some things that are similar to not such great law students, but still pretty advanced folks. Now, that was at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. Well, shortly thereafter, a very prominent study came out that's represented here, looking at how ChatGPT, and this was GPT-4, which is the next generation, which came out in March 2023, can perform on the bar exam. And ChatGPT, consistent with our earlier study, didn't do great. It maybe passed it, but at a very low level. It was at the 10% of test takers. But this study said, actually, GPT-4 can perform at the 90th percentile of bar exam test takers. So understand that, right? It is performing better than 9 out of 10 attorneys on the bar exam. And not just on multiple choice questions, but also on essays. Now, I can go into some sort of methodological limitations and why this number is probably closer to 60% rather than 90%, but the point still holds. Oh my gosh, we're not talking about a C+, not so great attorney anymore. Now with GPT-4, we're talking about a pretty good attorney, an attorney that's better than average, at least as measured by the bar exam. Now, recently, some literature has come out, throwing some cold water on this. And not only is there literature, but there are some well-known stories. So there's unfortunately someone else named Schwartz, totally unrelated to me, okay, in New York, who decided to file a brief using ChatGPT, put it in, the brief just fabricated some cases. And he became very embarrassed, when the judge and the other parties called him out and said, these cases in your filings are not real. What was going on? Hallucinations. These AIs are well known to confidently say things that are false, as you can probably see by my introduction here, right? Not everything in that introduction was 100% accurate, and sometimes they'll just completely fabricate things. And a recent prominent study looked into this and asked basic questions to GPT and found that the rate of hallucinations was actually reasonably high. And so on the one hand, we have this evidence that it's really good at spouting things that sound good, but on the other hand, sometimes those things aren't always accurate. And, that's not terribly uncommon with lawyers, I'll tell you that right now, but maybe that's not the type of lawyer you want to hire. So we start getting worried. And for that reason, I think we can confidently say right now that these tools are not going to completely replace lawyers, right? We can't have lawyers who just make things up, who every once in a while get things wrong. And right now, we're not at the point where you can just input in direct legal questions and be 100% confident or even 99% confident that you're getting a completely correct answer. And so for that reason, we've really started to ask the question, okay, how can AI be used with human intervention to produce results? And so now we're going to talk about the capabilities with human intervention of these tools, humans using these tools. So some research that I was involved in first looked at how do humans who are given human lawyers or law students who are given access to AI perform relative to humans who don't have AI. What we tend to find is that on simple tasks, this represents some pretty simple tasks, humans do a lot better with AI. Okay, giving them access to this tool really improves their capacity to answer correctly basic legal questions. But when you start getting to more complex legal questions, the benefit erodes almost to zero. And so these more complex tasks where we compared the performance of humans on legal tasks versus humans who have access to AI on legal tasks, we found access to AI actually didn't improve the average at all. So that's this publication over here. But there's something behind this data that's important. What this chart here shows you, that's drawn from one of my papers, is that the impact of providing AI to human lawyers was really not evenly distributed. So when you look at folks who were not very high performing, and I guess I should do this over here. I can't get my laser pointer to work. AI did improve their quality of their performance. And you can see that over here by the sort of folks who were not performing that well without AI. With AI, they started performing a lot better on legal tasks. But that performance went down as the baseline quality went up to the point where high performing students actually suffered when we gave them access to AI. Okay? And so that's what produced this average of no result. The low performing students improved, the high performing students, not so much. Okay. We also looked into, well, what if we don't just give the AI basic questions, but we do more advanced prompting techniques? So in the computer science literature, there are all sorts of techniques you can use to get better results from AI. And I want to focus on two in particular, few shot and grounded. So a few shot prompting approach is when you ask the AI a question, you get an answer, you say, no, give me an answer that looks more like this. And by the way, that's how lawyers tend to work, right? Hey, write a motion for me. Here's a sample motion I did last week. Use that as a template. And it turns out that significantly improved results. So you can look over here and see the basic approach, for instance, folks where the AI was performing at like 5% on the high difficulty tasks, but 30% when you gave them some examples. Even better is what's called grounded. And that's when you actually give the AI the underlying source material that you're testing. So if you want to write a memo on a case, you give it the AI the case. If you want to test them on a class, you give them the notes of the class. And we did that, and you can see over here that even without human intervention, if you gave, in our example, the AI all of my class notes, and then you have them have it perform on a legal exam, it outperforms the average university administrator. I haven't said this, it's quite exhausting. Okay, I mean, we have very high performing students. So this isn't your average lawyer. It's outperforming very high performing advanced law students once you start using more data. Now I want to go further. Everything I've talked about so far is just about legal exams. But at the end of the day, frankly, legal exams are sort of artificial and measure how where you are. Plenty of I tell my students all the time, plenty of excellent lawyers don't consider law school, and plenty of people don't want to be a lawyer who is right. So what we really want to know is, what about real legal tasks? And so to measure this, we did essentially a randomized control. We selected 4 basic. I need to go to the mic. Okay, got it. Sorry, I like to move around. I hope that you've been able to hear somewhat what I've been saying there online. So we looked at 4 basic legal tasks: drafting a legal memo, drafting a contract, drafting a complaint to initiate a lawsuit, and drafting a portion of an employee handbook. And these are sort of emblematic of the types of tasks that young lawyers would be asked to perform. And then we recruited 60 participants to participate in our study, and we split them into evenly distributed groups. We gave some of them access to AI to help them on their performance for 2 of the tasks and not the other 2, and then vice versa. We then blindly graded the results and recorded the time spent on tasks and surveyed our participants afterwards. So what were our results? So we found that there were statistically significant improvements when humans had access to AI for certain types of tasks. And you can see over here that is drafting a complaint and drafting a contract. We were able really to show that there was improvement. That's this red line over the blue line. By contrast, for some tasks, there was not an improvement at all. And in fact, there was a slight decrease, though not statistically significant. Okay. Note one thing about contract drafting and complaint drafting. Those are relatively less familiar to law students who are than, for instance, drafting a client memo, which is something that law students are trained on really from the get-go in law school. Okay. But what we also saw were persistent and consistent improvements in the time spent. So you can see for each of these different tasks, there was a significant, statistically significant, and also just significant in quantity improvement in the amount of time folks spent on each task. And when you put that together with the prior slide, that means that access to AI for each of these tasks had a statistically significant improvement in the time spent. They were doing it more quickly, either without harming quality or with improving quality. We also looked into the question of uneven distributions of improvement, and we saw the same thing we saw earlier, which was when you look at the quality improvements, they were disproportionately benefiting the folks who didn't perform well without access to AI, whereas folks with AI actually were at times being dragged down by that access. We also did a survey, and I know I'm going through this quickly, but I want to highlight a few of these results. After folks were participating in this, and by this point they spent 20 to 30 hours, each one of them, using AI and not using AI, we asked them a variety of questions. And participants really understood that access to AI significantly improved their speed, their capacity to get these tasks done well. They also reported an increase in personal satisfaction by using AI, and they reported that they were more likely to use AI after the experiment than they were before the experiment. All right. Now, that is some basic legal tasks that we focus on, but there's some recent work, and this is not my work, so I can't sort of vouch for it, and there's some methodological issues I have with it, but I think it's still instructive, where folks zeroed in on a task that seemed particularly well suited for Gen AI, and that is contract review. So what they did is they selected procurement contracts, and they said, we're going to have first junior attorneys review these contracts and spot issues, right? Oh, this doesn't comply with our rules over here, and suggest, and then pinpoint where in the contract those problems were. We're going to have senior attorneys do it. The senior attorneys are going to sort of decide what's ground truth. We're going to trust that their answers are correct. Junior attorneys, contract attorneys, and then a whole bunch of different AIs. Now, what were the results? Well, you can see over here that the contract attorneys were actually sort of the best. Those were the LPOs. But it wasn't that far behind the GPT-4 was performing in some of these tasks. And actually, GPT-4, interestingly, was outperforming some of the junior lawyers, right? But when you look at time, that's where things really stood out. So senior lawyers who were establishing ground truth were taking about 43 minutes to do this. Junior lawyers, 56 minutes. Contract attorneys, well, incentives matter, 201 minutes. And that might be why they were a little bit more accurate, because they were spending a lot more time. But of course, what was the time spent by these AIs, right, in the 1 minute category? So think about that. You're getting results basically, for all intents and purposes, instantaneously at almost zero cost that are basically as in between as good as the junior attorney and a contract attorney who spends way too long on the task, right? Okay, so where are we? I've been talking for a while and I want to make sure we get to the panel, but I think there's some really important implications of this research. We know that the capacity of these general LLM models to perform legal analysis, it really varies by task. We can't make categorical statements that this is going to change lawyering. It depends on the type of lawyering you do and the type of tasks you do, okay? We know that if you use these AIs effectively, you use good prompting techniques, their capacity to produce good work can increase significantly, particularly for high volume tasks. We know that the impact of AI and lawyering really depends on the baseline skill level of the lawyers. So AI is maybe going to mean a lot more for paralegals and junior associates than for upper level associates. It's probably going to mean a lot more for your everyday lawyer than for your Dorsey and Whitney lawyer, right? And so that also is, I think, significant. And we know there's actually a risk that if you start having Dorsey lawyers or other really high quality lawyers using this, you actually may see a decrease in quality. And I can talk a while about how that happens, but it's very hard to take someone else's bad draft and turn it into a good draft. Sometimes it's just better to start off with your own good draft, right? We know that the speed improvements can be astronomical, particularly when you get the tasks right. And so at the end of the day, I think we can conclude that the impact of Gen AI on the practice of law is really going to be significant, given that all of this work I've done and that I've discussed is based on general AI tools. And I haven't talked at all about the specialized tools that are out there that are being marketed to law firms that use some more sophisticated prompting techniques that are baked into it, that use what's called retrieval augmented generation to basically bake into the process what I call grounded prompting. And so we can be sure that this technology is going to improve and that these results really serve as a baseline on where we are now, not where we will be in the future. And so as a result, I think we can be confident that at least in the medium term, the practice of law is going to be fundamentally transformed, but differently in different areas. And I don't know where the future is going to take us, but I think we can know that the future will be significantly altered in the practice of law as a result of Gen AI. So if you want to learn more, here are the references to my papers, because of course, those are the most important papers that go over some of these results, and you can find them all online. I encourage you to go find them, all available freely. But with that, I want to stop so we can get to our panel. Thank you very much.
Let the panel set up here. I have a couple housekeeping items I want to cover as we get going. Make sure to sign your in-person attendance sheets there for CLE credit if you need that. For webinar attendees, materials and sign-in are available per the instructions there. For Q&A, we do have some cards sitting on the table that if you want to write down a question, I can't promise we're going to have time to get to those. We have a lot of ground to cover, but if I do get questions, I'll try and make room for them right at the end. So on behalf of Dorsey and Whitney, thanks for coming today, both the people who are online and in person here in Minneapolis. What a great introduction to the topic there by Professor Schwartz. Covered a lot of ground already. We're going to cover more in the panel. My name is Dave Townsend. I'm a partner here at Dorsey and Whitney. I focus on international trade and national security matters. I'm by no means an expert on AI like the panelists here. Although I have done some work with clients that are focused on developing AI, particularly helping them with export controls, questions that come up related to the hardware that's needed to teach AI and the export status of the data that's used to teach AI and sort of the back and forth communications on refining an AI model and whether that implicates export licensing requirements. Also, you should have received as attendees for the event a link to a longer slide deck than you're going to see us put up today that has additional materials on the use of AI in lawyering and some background on some issues I've been working on export controls and sanctions law related to artificial intelligence. So for the panel, I'm going to very briefly introduce them, and then I'll turn it over to them to say a little bit more about their work in AI. So we have Dr. Matthew Kallstrom is a consultant in the Division of Diagnostic Radiology at Mayo Clinic. He comes here from Rochester this morning. He's also a professor of radiology at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. Dr. Kallstrom's research is centered on interventional oncology. Although if you look at his bio and some of the events he's been at more recently, he's been doing a lot at Mayo Clinic related to AI and speaking about AI at various events. We also have Caroline Sweeney from Dorsey and Whitney. Caroline is responsible for the delivery of our firm's e-discovery services, including legal mind managed review services, litigation technical support, and trial technology support. Caroline also helps me and my group sometimes with internal investigations and document review associated with that. She's been working with AI since way before there was ChatGPT, so she'll talk a little bit about that as well as the more recent developments in AI. And then finally last but not least is Jessica Libby. If you've been attending our International Business Roundtable series, Jessica's a familiar face to you. She's at KPMG. She's a principal in their U.S. Trade and Customs Service line of work. She's also the co-leader for their social strategy and human rights practice. She leads KPMG's anti-forced labor service line, providing support to KPMG clients as they respond to supply chain commitments and legal requirements related to the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, or the UFLPA. So let's get to it with those introductions. Dr. Kallstrom, I'm going to start with you. If you could just talk a little bit about your work at Mayo Clinic and AI.
Thanks very much. Great to be here. Really, inspiring to see what Global Minnesota is doing, and really, it's been a discussion already that's been fantastic. Really appreciate the great talk. So my role at Mayo, I'm in radiology. I'm chair of our department, been responsible for bringing AI into our organization in terms of how we use machine learning. Our team is designed to both do the discovery as well as translation and deployment into our practice. One of the models that we follow at Mayo is really a decentralized approach to doing discovery. And then we basically, support groups that are really advancing what we think is important for the organization in, both the administrative side as well as patient care. We have about 200 machine learning models that we've developed internally. Of those, about 30 of those have actually been deployed. So as part of that, when we use AI, we had to build out a quality management system so we can work with things. Software as a medical device is a key element in terms of being able to use these internally. Since we had built out this team, we also work with cardiovascular medicine, which is another area where there's a lot of AI activity, and now responsible for our generative AI program at Mayo in terms of how we're building a team, working with partners. And maybe some of you know Jim Rogers. He's my partner. He's our Chief Business Development Officer, very active in Medical Alley in the Twin Cities. And together we've been building partnerships to enable and expand our team so that we can build capability and do the multi-threaded components that are necessary for building Gen AI.
Yeah, great. And Caroline, if you could go next. Caroline, as I said, has been really focused on AI here at Dorsey & Whitney. She's also been heading up a task force that the firm has created to look at the benefits and risks and guidelines for use of AI here at the firm.
So first of all, thank you. I feel very honored to be sitting on this panel with the three of you and appreciate all of you taking the time this morning to join us. As Dave indicated, I do lead our e-discovery efforts, but I also have broader responsibility for looking at how our firm can leverage technology to support practice areas and across the firm, not just the litigation or investigations, and also how we can leverage technology to meet client needs, to promote efficiency and innovation through technology and automation adoption. And in that role, I have probably for the last year plus been co-leading our AI task force, and we've been actively piloting different tools. We've been looking at demonstrations of a variety of different generative AI tools. We've drafted a policy around use right now of generative AI within the firm. And we're also considering the business impact of generative AI adoption. And that means that I also get to be involved in setting the strategy for where this firm is going in AI adoption or generative AI adoption. I think one of the things to stress, and I agree with Professor Schwartz, that generative AI is not, at least at this point, going to replace attorneys. I think that it's the next technological evolution that we're going to be going through as an industry, and it's going to ultimately change how we do things, but it's not going to get rid of the need for lawyers. And while it might help with more of the rote tasks that we undertake, it's not going to replace it. Again, at least at this point, the nuanced expertise that an attorney, a more senior attorney, experienced attorney, is going to bring to a legal issue, the analysis of a legal issue. I think there's a lot of frenzy around adoption, like, oh, we got to bring these tools in, we got to start using this stuff. How are we going to use it? But what we've been looking at is identifying specific use cases where it's appropriate to use generative AI tools. So things like legal research or drafting documents. One of the use cases on the corporate side is drafting and reviewing negotiating contracts. To the extent that document automation is part of this AI, that's something that we've been looking at. But we're also looking at how is AI going to impact attorney training? How is it going to impact matter staffing in the future? Will there be further commoditization of those rote tasks I was talking about that will lend themselves to the use of generative AI? Can we add or grow our business by offering legal services around how organizations are using or adopting or defining policies around the use of generative AI? And can we increase work because we've now created greater efficiencies by adopting this technology, and therefore we have the ability to potentially take on more? So those are some of the things that we've been looking at and evaluating in the past year plus.
Yeah. And Jessica, if you could talk a little bit about your work at KPMG and how you are already using or plan to use AI.
Sure. Thank you, Dave. And I too want to thank Global Minnesota. This is such an important topic, and the timeliness of this panel is really relevant. So again, thank you to my fellow panelists for joining us today. You know, trade and customs, if you're familiar with this practice, it is an area that certainly has a lot of technical intricacies, but there are a lot of manual processes that would certainly benefit from the use of automation. And so if you're familiar with some of that automation, there's already a lot of automation deployed in this space, but this is certainly the next kind of iteration of that technology. So with that, I'm going to start my comments with, we are certainly looking at AI, but it has limitations. So I feel very confident to say that as long as I have remaining in my career, I'm not concerned that I'm going to become irrelevant. 10 years from now or 15, 20 years from now, that may be a different situation. At KPMG, we are looking at various AI capabilities. We actually have built large language models. We affectionately call this particular automation KATE, KPMG's automated tariff environment. And KATE effectively looks at product classification. So everything you see in front of you that's tangible, this water bottle, it has a 10-digit classification. When you bring it into the United States or every other country around the world, there is a duty rate assigned to it. So effectively a tax. So it's very important that you get that classification right. Otherwise, you could be underpaying or overpaying your duty rate. The way that we look at KATE, though, is effectively a research tool. It is an enabling capability. Last year in November, U.S. Customs actually responded to an inquiry from a trade association regarding the use of AI technology or derivative technology as it relates to classification specifically. And they indicated, and I'm going to quote specifically, there's a threshold requirement as relates to U.S. Customs around the use of reasonable care as it relates to compliance obligations. And specifically what U.S. Customs said is it cannot be said at this time that reliance on AI necessarily constitutes the exercise of reasonable care. In other words, just using AI without including what we call a human in the loop, a professional review, would not constitute reasonable care. So the way that we look at it at KPMG, and again, we're using ChatGPT, we have our own internal models, we have Kate, is it really is an enabling capability. It's something where we still want our professionals involved. We really look at it as if that the AI capability is an intern or a very early associate. So we give them the opportunity to use that as a research tool, but there is significant oversight associated with the information contained.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you, Jessica. It's really interesting to hear those insights from all three of the panelists that I just introduced, because you get to hear about how each of those institutions is sort of trying to figure out how to begin to use at least generative AI in their day-to-day work. So the first question for the panel, I'm going to start with you, Dr. Kallstrom, and then we can sort of go to the others as they want to chime in. Mayo Clinic is obviously a leader in all facets of healthcare services. I was wondering if you could start the discussion by talking a little bit about, maybe an example or two of where Mayo Clinic has already begun using AI, and then areas where you foresee growth and the ability to integrate it more in the future.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So I'd say one of the, I think, recognitions in healthcare is that AI is going to touch almost everything that we do. It comes from the point of, everyone recognizes when you talk to a physician, at a visit, that physician's actually spending more time with a computer than they are with a patient. And if we can pull that component back into the background using AI, that will allow people to kind of get back to, talking to the patient, trying to understand what their issues are. And quite often you learn a lot just in the discussion versus all the data. So I think data, critical, but human interaction, more important. So in part, what we're doing, and we have in pilot already, is we're using GPT-4 Turbo on the front end to actually capture the event that might be happening with any patient, whether it be in the hospital or in an outpatient visit. Part of the issues that Dr. Schwartz outlined is we can't be wrong in terms of how we both generate a node or use data. So a lot of what we're doing in terms of the architecture and structure on this kind of reduce administrative burden approach is to keep the source document, use a large language model to summarize some of this. There's one instance, for example, outside medical records, we'll go through hundreds and hundreds of pages to try and understand the patient's history. But keep that link and the grounding back to the original source document. And then we can use our teams to actually do what we consider the high code element of this, which is to do data extraction and turn that into a summary. Every bit of that is actually grounded back to the original content. Also, our teams are, it's just so incredible to work with them. One of our AI scientists said, we can do this, we can generate the text, but how do we know that it's truly accurate? Because now we have to worry about people using this as a black box. That content is there, but are they going to do the work to make sure that it's correct? So you can actually apply what we call a reverse RAG, go back and now look at the content that was generated and go back and search for it in the original source document and score the accuracy of that information. So we have to do a lot of work to make sure that the things that we generate actually link back to source content. So big effort in terms of reducing administrative burden. These ambient listening tools, I think they're actually going to work. We've been doing pilots with a couple of these across our enterprise. Take that, use that to generate a summary of what's happened. And then, the great benefit of a large language model, you can actually edit it without touching it. We always lose in that editing phase. And it sounds like we're having the same challenges around first draft versus what's useful. So we think that'll help us on reduce administrative burden using generative AI. What we want to be able to do, though, is kind of elevate what we do as a practice, reducing expense on the administrative burden and burnout and all the things that people have related to working with this sort of content is one element. But we really think and have deployed some machine learning tools where we can actually elevate early detection and diagnosis of patients and start to harness that data and build it in a generative approach. I'll just give one example of how we're doing this with partnership in Cerebrus. It's a startup company in California with $750 million of funding. So they have a fair bit of startup capital. But they're exciting to work with because they want to go after tough problems. And one of the things that we're going to try is to ask a pretty simple question and see whether or not generative AI will actually help us. We're building a model now using genomics data from the repositories that we have. About 100,000 patients with whole genome exome sequencing, and build this in a way so that we can actually predict whether patients will respond to treatment. If anybody's been through a medical odyssey, you start with something, you got to wait 3 months. Did it work? Maybe you get some imaging on the way. Are you a responder or a non-responder? We do know that it's interesting when you actually talk to clinicians that are caring for patients, the signal is there that they actually have a sense for who's going to respond, but they'll follow this standard approach to try and get people to that care. Quite often, cost is lower on the front end and they become more expensive as you go to targeted therapies. It's likely that we'll be able to identify which patients would benefit from therapy sooner and figure out how that might work. That's one example. We also are working to try and build encoders of all the other kind of content that we work with. Text is one, but radiology, imaging, build encoders to capture that chest x-ray, for example. Can we simplify the burden of reading those and make us faster at what we do? Hopefully more accurate, or at least as accurate. And every step of this, though, we've been talking about it already, is pairing that content with the physician or other provider to add to their knowledge and make sure that they understand what that content really is. Make sure it's accurate, make sure it's grounded.
Yeah. Yeah, and Caroline, you talked a little bit about not only Dorsey, exploring how we might be able to use generative AI to help with work product of attorneys, but also with attorney training. Can you talk a little bit about that, where we might be able to be using these tools and platforms to help with new lawyers or summer associates as they're coming in?
Well, in that regard, I think it's about how are these junior attorneys being trained to use these technologies so that it can support them in their work. One of the things that law schools are starting to do, I'd be curious to know if you're doing this, but bringing like Lexis Plus AI and some of these other tools in. So young lawyers coming out of law school are already trained on these technologies, and they're learning new ways to conduct legal research, to generate drafts and what have you. And then it's important to be continuing that training and making that available to them. I wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit too about the fact that, we've been, as you said, using forms of AI for probably 15 years. Whether when we first started off, it was around concept clustering and discovery. So taking documents from a client and organizing them so that similar documents were together, and that helped facilitate the discovery review process. Then we started with machine learning, where we did predictive coding, and then that transitioned to the use of continuous active learning, which involves the human and the machine teaching how to find responsive documents in litigation or key documents in an investigation. Yesterday, I spent a couple of hours with a e-discovery vendor talking about the next evolution, which is using generative AI to say, okay, here's the case. This is what it's about. These are the key players. Here's some key terminology. And this is what's going to make a document responsive or important to this litigation. Help me find it. And then the tool is able to go through and identify, based on that prompting that you're doing, the responsive documents in the collection. And then it's able to give you a confidence score. So you know which ones perhaps you can accept the machine's decision on, and which ones you need to then have human intervention to resolve or to confirm that in fact the machine is understanding correctly. And that, I think, is going to be the next significant evolution, and probably has implications for a lot of contract attorneys out there, because it means that we're going to be able to conduct document review or kickstart investigations much more quickly and potentially eventually more cost effectively. I mean, one of the challenges too right now from our perspective is the cost of these tools. They aren't, and the vendors are still trying to figure out how to price this. But it also has some downstream, like later this year, many of the e-discovery vendors are introducing the ability to use this for privilege identification and being able to build privilege logs in discovery. We're also looking, as you mentioned, with contract drafting, we've been looking at a lot of different tools in that regard. And historically, we've been using for the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, 5 or 6 years, extractive AI to push a bunch of documents through the platform and have it identify, what are the terms of various terms within the contract that can be used for M&A due diligence, or just informing organizations around what are their obligations with respect to contracts. We want to take that a step further and look at more contract drafting and negotiation, as I said, and redlining capabilities. So those are some of the use cases that we've been exploring. And then we've also been using natural language processing for legal research. So the ability to, rather than doing like and or Boolean searches to conduct legal research, being able to pose a question to the legal research platform and have it understand that natural language and come back with the research results. And so we're taking that to the next level with testing some tools like case text, co-counsel, with and Lex. Right now we're in the midst of a pilot with Lexis Plus AI. I think what we're finding is that these tools have a lot of promise. They are very expensive to implement, and we're not confident right now where our ROI is. So we're still determining what are the appropriate tools for us to be bringing in and starting to implement. We've got additional pilots on the project plan, if you will. So using generative AI with our document management system, can we mine that data to give us information about what judges have we been before in different courts around the country, deal points from deal document, successful or closed deals, for generating documents. Here's the motion that I've used before successfully, use it as a draft and start pulling new content together to draft various types of documents. So there's the other thing I think some of you are already using, both of you, is Microsoft Copilot, and how can we use that to help us with simple things like drafting emails or translating content, recording meetings, and then being able to use that data. But that also has information governance implications. So, how long is that data retained? Where is it stored? Who owns it? If you're in a litigious organization, how are you able to collect that information for discovery eventually, et cetera? So lots of promise, lots of training to be had in terms of what those implications are on our jobs going forward.
Dave, can I build on that real quickly? So Caroline was talking a little bit about training, and I think Professor Schwartz mentioned it as well. You know, we're very excited about this technology, but in its maturity curve, we're not at a point where we can fully trust it. And so I think it's very important, and this is something at the core kind of tenet of what we're looking at as it relates to our professionals. You can't lose the building blocks of the professional capabilities. So there are core areas within trading customs, and I'm sure within the legal field as well, where those core tenets and foundational technical capabilities allow future state strategy development and capabilities that frankly are well beyond where we're at right now with this technology. So as we're bringing new professionals into this field, we are still teaching them those fundamentals, recognizing that in the future, those fundamentals may not be necessary for them to facilitate, but when they are a manager or a partner within the firm, they're going to have those fundamentals to make the right strategic decision for the client. And I think that's a really important part not to lose in this conversation.
I completely agree. It's trust but verify. And I can say, we just last week had an incident where we're using the generative AI to do some legal research around one of the Sarah Silverman copyright case. And the generative AI came back with an analysis, and the partner that was doing this testing said, this is not accurate. And we went back to the vendor and they did some research and came back just yesterday, in fact, and said, you're right, it's not accurate. But it just underscores the importance of, you can't just believe what it gives you back. You have to do that analysis. And so you still have to make sure that attorneys are being trained on how to conduct that analysis. It's a little bit different maybe because it's not create this from scratch. It's use this to help you create, but now you have to have the techniques to analyze it and determine the accuracy.
Yeah. And I'll just say one thing about that in terms of training. Of course, my job is mostly, or at least significantly, to train lawyers. And one of the questions I get asked a lot from students, well, when are we going to, use Gen AI? I know that you're really into this. And I actually take the approach in my first year classes of banning Gen AI and doing a hard ban where when they're being evaluated, they're in class in a lockdown browser. And that's because to establish the fundamental skills, you need to learn to think without the support of these tools. And then once you build those foundational skills, that's when you're ready to then learn how to bring those foundational skills to the task of scrutinizing what you're getting, doing the independent analysis, and learning over time when you can trust them and when you can't. But it's a very difficult balance. And I'll just tell you, it's very, very hard to police. I mean, any of you who, have students or who are familiar with, this is becoming a massive problem in education in general, where it's very hard to police the use of AI by students. And it's a real challenge, especially because these tools are getting smaller, easier to access. These days, you can access them without being on the internet. You can access them on your phone. And it is a very easy way to quickly do well in school. And so being cognizant about how you train any professional these days is a really huge concern, and I think has to be done thoughtfully. And I didn't come up with this analogy, but I think it's really apt. The analogy I like to sort of use in thinking about this is, I want my third grader, she has to learn how to do multiplication and addition and subtraction without a calculator. It's really important, right? And eventually, my ninth grader, she gets to use a calculator. She mastered that. But you're not going to give a second grader a calculator because then they'll never learn how to do the math on their own. And so that's, I think, an important principle in training in any context, to start without the tools, to ensure that as students develop into, professionals, they're going to have the capabilities to really scrutinize effectively the AI output they're getting.
Professor Schwartz, let me just follow up on that one. In terms of the legal profession, one thing you see that courts, and I'll sort of focus on courts, courts often will have you, if you're going to file something with the court, you might have to disclose things about how you put together your paper or your brief, I should say, or the materials you're filing. And so I just wonder, in the legal profession, don't we have some procedural safeguards we can build in? You could say, okay, if you're going to use AI to help you with your brief, you have to tell the court, or in the case of a academic setting, you have to, explain to the professor how you used AI to help with your research, or to maybe even to draft the paper, and then sign something saying you do it. Of course, you could have somebody who's willing to lie, but it makes it tougher to lie when you have to sign something sort of being transparent about how you use it.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of judges who are, producing these standing orders where you have to disclose if you used AI and generative AI. I think those are fine. I mean, honestly, I think that at the end of the day, our general principles of professional obligations really are sufficient, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what type of judge you're submitting your filings to. You have an ethical obligation or professional obligation to ensure that they're accurate and correct. And there are all sorts of ways to fail doing that with AI and without AI. And so I do wonder whether this is just sort of a temporary phenomenon where, because Gen AI is so hot and there are some very, high profile examples of people misusing Gen AI, that we've gotten these, standing orders. I don't know that at the end of the day, that the risks associated with this technology are such that we need specialized rules for professional obligations or ethics as opposed to the general rules we have. And I do frankly worry that some of these specialized disclosure rules will actually discourage the use of technology that can benefit clients. So one thing I think about a lot is, okay, if as an attorney, and this gets a little bit to sort of the, we all have conflicts of interest, and none of us wants to be replaced by a computer, and none of us wants even to necessarily, have less work to do because of a computer. And if you know that you can do the work twice as fast and produce a sufficiently good outcome, but you have some excuse, say, oh, well, that's not, maybe actually you're not going to take that opportunity. And in my view, attorneys have fiduciary obligations to their clients, and part of that fiduciary obligation is to do the job as efficiently as possible. And so I think there's a balance that needs to be struck here. We have to recognize the risks, recognize the problems, but at the same time, I think that once you start erecting special barriers to the use of Gen AI, once you begin creating special risks, I mean, there's a risk that a first-year associate's going to get a legal issue wrong. That happens all the time at firms too. And
Not Dorsey, of course.
not Dorsey. But I think that we should, I'm not sure whether that sort of specialized disclosure, specialized approach is where we should go long term.
And if I can just add to that, I think one of the concerns that is raised for me is some of these standing orders, they're talking about AI, just using the term AI, when what they really mean is generative AI, and trying to avoid the hallucinations of made up cases and what have you. And it just baffles me that we continue to see these incidents where people are submitting cases with motions or whatever with false cases being cited, and then they're saying things like, well, I asked the generative AI and it told me it was accurate. I was also going to point out to folks that in your materials, there are some links to the ABA's attorney responsibility in the age of generative AI, the California Bar's practical artificial intelligence in the practice of law, the Florida ethics opinion around the use of generative AI. So there's some reference materials there if you're interested.
Yeah, and actually, I'm gonna go to an example. Dr. Karlstrom was mentioning that Mayo Clinic has put some sort of simple questions to AI platforms in the practice of medicine. We did that in advance for there's a couple examples in the materials that you should have received, and this is one of them. So I thought it'd be fun. And this is kind of putting Jessica on the spot because it's in her wheelhouse. And I'm an international trade lawyer. A lot of what I do overlaps with what Jessica does. So this is a pretty basic question. You know, this could be the kind of question if you were sitting in-house at a company, maybe you don't import, or you don't import directly from China, but you've reached an agreement with a supplier. You're saying to yourself, oh yeah, we'll buy something from you. And then a bell goes off, but isn't there something special about, you know, doing business with China under US trade law? I don't really, you know, if you're sitting in-house, you say, I don't really know much about trade law. Go to Chat GPT, you put that question into into Chat GPT, and this is what it came back with. So Jessica, how would you grade or evaluate this answer?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dave. And actually, when I looked at the answer and the response here, I would probably give it about a C. Like, it will get you across the line. You'll understand the steps you need to take to identify if the product that you plan to import has these 301 retaliatory duties. The problem with this is that these 301 retaliatory duties that the US put in place against China, they could be upwards of 25% duty. So if you get this wrong, there are significant financial implications. The other piece of this is, again, this gets you across the line, basic information. The best part of this answer is number 4, consult with customs experts, right? Because there's a lot of things that go into these decisions. Once you have the baseline information around potential duties that you're going to owe on these products, there's a lot of other factors. For example, not mentioned here, but there's a lot of exclusions actually on the 301 tariffs. So if you're dealing with anything associated with med device, a lot of the things that we needed during the pandemic, a lot of those products actually fall under exclusions. So you could be importing a product and you're thinking you're going to pay 25% duty, but the reality is if you put the right exclusion number on there, it's 0. So you're missing out on an opportunity. The other piece of this is that country of origin, you may think this is China. I get this question a lot from clients. It's shipping from the port of Shanghai. Of course, it's country of origin China. That is not accurate. Just because it's exported from the port of Shanghai does not mean that that product's origin is actually Chinese. There's a whole nother set of rules around country of origin. And then the last thing I'll just mention is there's a lot of strategies here too. You could understand how you could move that product or move some of the manufacturing processes. There's other tariff strategies that may impact your overall duty spend. So again, I'd give this a C, but I would heavily weight on consult with customs experts to take it to the next level.
Yeah, I agree. And the country of origin, omitting that was bad. If a first-year associate put this in, it might be a good place to start in terms of a memo. I sort of, and this is for you, Professor Schwartz, I wondered, you just heard an expert, a high performer, if you will, evaluate this answer from Chat GPT, and you had said in your presentation that a lot of times the high performers, or at least I think for students, were, as you put it, suffering by using AI rather than just sort of starting from scratch and writing this. I could imagine if Jessica saw this as a draft answer from one of her associates, she would probably just delete it and take 15 minutes and start sketching out the the major issues rather than using this. So can you speak to that a little bit? Do I have that right in terms of if you've got somebody who's really focused in this area, this is too general, it doesn't help? How does it? Because I do think that, just to be clear, I do think that this answer could be helpful if you were in a general counsel's office, you had no idea how trade duties work, and you just put it in, and this would get you started.
Yeah, I think there are a variety of sort of ways that actually using AI can make things worse. One is just the time piece, right? If you decide ultimately to jettison, you spend time trying to figure out the ideal prompt, and you decide, oh, this isn't, I'm going to start from scratch. Obviously, that can produce some cost. But I think the bigger risk that we saw in some of our research is that the Gen AI will sometimes produce an answer, and then you'll get a little bit of tunnel vision. Well, you start focusing in on the issues that are spotted by the result, and you won't think sort of more outside the box. So, one of the big jobs of lawyers and law students is issue spotting, right? Okay, here's this, actually, what are the issues here? Is it really a 301? Now I'm going to make things up. I already revealed I don't know anything about international. Is it really a 301 duty question? Maybe it's a 308 duty question. Maybe it's a 308 non-duty question with customs, with who knows, right? But once you start looking at the answer AI and using it as a first draft, you can get tunnel vision where you miss other issues. So that was one of the things we saw when we did our more qualitative analysis of why some of our higher performing students were not doing as well once they were using it. Another thing that's tricky is organization. A big job of a lawyer is to organize analysis clearly and in a way that is both succinct and sort of analytically helpful. And trying to integrate human decision-making and AI decision-making can be tricky when you're dealing with text. It's hard. I mean, if folks have co-authored here, it's hard to take two co-authored drafts and put them together and then to get something that reads really well. Sometimes you'll get discontinuities, you'll get repetition, you'll get changes in style. And that is another real challenge when it comes to using these technologies. So I think those are two ways in which that can produce problems when the output you're looking for is some sort of polished analytical text. I'd be curious, sort of, in other spaces, whether that is a problem. I don't know, for instance, Dr. Kallstrom, if for you've seen instances where there are risks that actually, you have superb doctors that they may actually get things wrong more often by using AI. Is that ever something that you worry about or see where maybe it's leading you down to focus on an issue and then you don't see, oh, gee, there's a problem with this part of the scan as opposed to that part of the scan that the AI is focusing you on?
Yeah, I think one of the problems we have is, by omission. What did you include in your thinking problem? Did you keep your scope wide enough as you start? So this narrowing and getting kind of into the weeds pretty quickly is a challenge. I do think what we try to do is have people think independently, just like you've all been talking about. What are your thoughts before? It is not unusual though for someone that's challenged with a question, don't have a diagnosis. They'll start to go to Google, and they'll say, gosh, what about this? And quite often it'll be helpful. I think, but to get to that higher level question, this ends up narrowing your thinking so quickly that people can lose sight of what they're really after. What other data do I need to make a diagnosis? Should have I done X, Y, or Z? It doesn't give you that answer, at least correctly.
I also think one of the other risks that we haven't really talked a lot about, but kind of starts to touch on this, is around bias within the AI tools themselves, and to what extent, tools where an organization might use a AI hiring app to help screen applicants. And I think there's instances where those have been found to perpetuate bias in the hiring process, or instances where healthcare algorithms have perpetuated bias, and same with sentencing guidelines and racial bias being perpetuated through the use of these tools. So I think that's another risk that folks have to be aware of and have to be looking for, testing for, as they're starting to introduce these types of tools.
The other thing I'll just mention, sorry, Carolyn.
No,
please,
go ahead.
Is, you can adjust your approach in these tools. And part of that is maybe changing the persona that is attached to these questions and how you're asking them. So it really does at point beg the question of, are you answer shopping? If you're tweaking that persona just a little bit, you get a slightly different response. Maybe you don't like that, you go to the next one, but the question becomes, what is the most accurate response? Not the one you like, but the most accurate. And that's, I think, again, another risk of sort of answer shopping.
That is a little bit built into these tools. I mean, they're sort of built to be a bit obsequious, right? You heard that a bit when the introduction with me and all the things that it fabricated about how great I am, which, most of which are not true, right? It'll give you the answer you think you want. If you ask a leading question, it will be much more likely to give you that answer. And so there is a real risk both with answer shopping, if you produce multiple drafts and then you're sort of going with the one that best fits your prior intuitions, as well as the risk that the way you ask the question will lead the AI to give you an answer that may or may not be accurate or the most accurate that you're looking for. One of the things I tell my students, and I often say, is the best thing to do is actually not to use these tools to produce a first draft, them to produce a second draft. You produce the first draft, you do the independent
Mhm.
thinking, you do that hard work, and then use it to help you refine. And I think that sort of captures, a basic intuition and lesson that I've seen in working with these tools and helping others in terms of making sure that you avoid that type of problem.
That kind of brings us back to the whole training issue and teaching
Yeah.
people prompt engineering and how to query these tools appropriately and what have you. One of the other things that's recently come about, I don't know if you've heard about the big announcement around Sora, where you can type in a description and it will produce an image for you. So I want to see a picture of a tractor with a farmer wearing a red hat, and it produces that. And one of the risks for those of you who are litigators out there is concerns around the ability to generate evidence that is difficult to distinguish real from not real. And therefore, how do you authenticate visual images and what have you?
Yeah, the one thing that's in the materials that the PowerPoint that you should have received is a summary of the Biden administration, or the executive order from President Biden that sets out, I think it's over 100 action items for the US federal government from 50 different federal entities related to AI. And some of what's in there talks about authentication and identification of images, data, content that is not created by a human, but is created by AI, so that the federal government, at least within the agencies as they're doing their work, identifies what is AI and then treats it accordingly. That executive order, by the way, it's really wide ranging. I mean, it touches on all sorts of industries, the whole of the federal government, and then it creates a series of deadlines for those agencies to take the action specified. It's pretty broad. It's not very specific in the sense that it's setting policy. It's just saying, here are things we need to do. And some of it's very common sense, kind of like I was just saying. Obviously, the government needs to know when they're dealing with something that's not real, if it's a photo, for example. But some of it goes a little bit further, and I think it sets a framework for years to come of federal action in this space. So shifting gears a little bit, and again, going back to you, Jessica, the one thing we both do in international trade is due diligence. Sometimes clients will come to us and say, can you look at this counterparty to make sure we're not dealing with somebody that is subject to restrictions under US law? You similarly, Jessica, help clients look at whether there might be indicia of forced labor, for example, in a supply chain. And I'm pretty optimistic about the ability of AI to sort of provide us new information in that space that we might not see. I mean, one of the worst things is when a client comes to us, asks us that sort of a question, and there's something in the public domain that we don't see. Obviously, we can't see everything in the public domain, right? So we're going to do our best to look at the particular counterparty or company or person that we're being asked to look at. But if there's something in the public domain that suggests a link between that person and, say, a company that they say a sanctioned person and a company that they control, that's the kind of thing we need to tell the client. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think this can add value to due diligence that companies have to perform?
I definitely think AI is going to play a role with due diligence, but again, within certain restrictions. I recently was at Green Biz 24, which is a phenomenal sustainability conference that occurs in Scottsdale. And half of the sessions were associated with AI. And this is about sustainability, ESG, human rights, forced labor, half of them, climate change associated with AI capabilities. And specifically Microsoft had a significant role in that. I think when you look at how we can use AI as it relates to due diligence, it does help us to aggregate information. So whenever we're talking with a client, we'll pull all of the recent articles, make sure we're doing adverse media searches, understanding kind of what that looks like. Have they been spoken about adversely in various publications, made connections to various potential entities that have been connected to forced labor? The limitation really is around, there's a lot of automation and tools out there that are doing kind of neural mapping around supply chains. And that neural mapping, what they're looking at specifically is, for example, if you have a factory next to an educational or vocational school in northern China that happens to be in Xinjiang, they're making a connection that vocational school is providing Uyghur labor to this factory, which would be in violation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Just based on proximity and GPS location, no other connection otherwise. And that is really dangerous because companies are trying to do the right thing within their supply chains and manage their supply chains in a responsible way. And they're looking at data and they're looking at these neural maps and saying, hey, I have a risk here. Great that it's identified the risk, but there needs to be another layer of review. You need to go out to that facility, understand what activities are really taking place, look at various facets of indicators as it relates to forced labor, specifically under the ILO parameters, and understand, what is your level of risk and do you need to be working with that supplier more closely? So again, I think it is a starting point. I think it's going to give you a lot of great data, but it really is kind of directional in nature and you need to take additional steps to verify.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely what the way I'm picturing it is a supplemental tool
Absolutely.
to the work you're already doing. And we're almost out of time here. So just a couple quick notes and then I'll turn it to the panel for closing thoughts. I want to say thanks to Global Minnesota for helping sponsor the event, organize the event, and help make this possible today. Also, thanks to KPMG for the same, and a special thanks for all the panelists for coming in. It's really a great panel of people who are really focused in this area. So with that said, closing thoughts or ideas before we end the event?
I can offer one thing. It's amazing that we're dealing with the same issues and concerns, around what does it mean for our future and how we do our roles? How do we use these tools in a safe way? How do we build and understand the capabilities and make sure that the safeguards are there? And I think it's moving so quickly. And one of the challenges we have in healthcare, we're highly regulated, and being able to innovate in the face of some of this risk, something we'll need your help with. I think it's to shape guidelines, regulatory, in a way that we can actually do this in a responsible way and yet still innovate is going to be the delicate balance coming forward.
Yeah, I think one of the risk areas that we really didn't delve too much into is around data privacy and PII, PHI protection, and the importance as you're starting to use these tools of understanding data flows between your organization and whatever applications you're using, making sure if you're using data to train models internally, how are you protecting PII and PHI so that you aren't in violation of whether it's GDPR or various data privacy laws within the US? In your resources, again, there is a link to the Global AI Legislation Tracker from IAPP, which is probably something that you might find useful, especially if you're operating on a global basis, to be looking at those different regulatory or laws that might implicate you or implicate what you're doing.
Okay, 1 minute.
I'll just quickly say, I think Dr. Kallstrom did a lovely job. This technology is here. It's really up to the user and to the organization to ensure you're using it responsibly. And I think that becomes the bigger burden for all of us, is to understand, how do we use it ethically? How do we use it to really drive efficiencies within our organization and recognize that it's here and we need to understand how we'll do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think lawyers have in some sense, a special role. It's both a tool we need to use to produce our work product, but we're also at the forefront of developing the rules regarding when you can use it and when you can't. And I think that creates a lot of difficult challenges, but that needs to happen, in my view, both from a top up and bottom down perspective. We need rules in specific areas, recognizing specific risks. There are different risks in medicine than in law, but at the same time, there are commonalities, right? And so I think you need both context specific rules and rules that look at this from a more holistic perspective. I think hopefully we're getting there with things like the the Biden executive order, but we're still very much in the early days of figuring out how to regulate this technology.
Yeah. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate you coming out.